The sun did not rise over the Persian Gulf on the morning of February 28, 2026. It was simply replaced by a second, artificial dawn. To those watching from the flight deck of the USS Gerald R. Ford, the horizon flickered with a rhythmic, pulsing heat, the signature of 500 Tomahawk missiles tearing through the ionized air toward the Iranian coast. It was the beginning of Operation Epic Fury, a name conceived in a windowless room in Arlington by men who believed that history could be mastered with enough processing power and a clean enough kill chain. They called it a surgical decapitation, a phrase that suggested the precision of a scalpel, ignoring the fact that when you cut the head off a hydra, the blood spill is never contained to the operating table. For decades, the tension between the United States, Israel, and the Islamic Republic of Iran had been a coiled spring, a cold war of shadows, proxies, and cyber attacks. But the spring had finally snapped. The intelligence, later debated in the halls of a fractured Congress, but at the moment treated as gospel, suggested that Tehran was 72 hours away from the threshold. This wasn't just about the ability to enrich uranium. It was about the final mating of a miniaturized warhead onto a Shahab-3 missile, capable of reaching Tel Aviv, Riyadh, or any American base in the CENTCOM theater. The decision was made in a frantic, midnight session of the National Security Council. Israel had already fueled its F-35 Adir jets. The US had no choice but to lead the charge or be dragged into the wake of a unilateral Israeli strike that would set the world on fire without a fire extinguisher in sight. The first part of the script, the Great Opening, was supposed to be the easiest. The American military machine is a marvel of the modern world, a leviathan of logistics and kinetic energy that operates with the cold efficiency of an algorithm. Within the first 6 hours, the Iranian Integrated Air Defense System, or IADEDS, was effectively blinded. Radars across the jagged peaks of the Zagros Mountains were turned into slag by high-speed anti-radiation missiles, HARM, that followed their signals like hounds to a scent. The world watched on grainy infrared feeds as the invincible S-300 and S-400 batteries, the pride of Russian engineering, were reduced to burning husks of steel. In the Situation Room in Washington, there was a tentative, professional silence, the kind of silence that precedes a celebration. They had hit the IRGC headquarters in Tehran. They had hit the centrifuge halls at Natanz and Fordo, burying the nuclear dream under 1 million tons of concrete and twisted rebar. The mission was technically a success before the first pot of coffee had gone cold. But as the first 12 hours bled into the second day, a chilling realization began to settle over the command centers in Tampa and Tel Aviv. The Lion's Sleep Protocol, a defensive strategy Iran had spent 40 years perfecting, was not a myth or a propaganda tool. It was a reality. The American strategy relied on the shock and awe doctrine of 2003, updated for the high-tech 2020s. It assumed that if you destroyed the brain, the body would stop fighting. It assumed a centralized command and control structure that would shatter under the weight of hypersonic precision. But the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, was not a traditional army. It was a franchise. It was a decentralized, cellular organism designed specifically to function without a nervous system. When the supreme leader was confirmed, killed in the initial bunker-buster strike on a hardened facility in Qom, the expected white flags did not appear over the mosques. Instead, the Gashgai orders went out. Thousands of pre-recorded, encrypted messages sent via low-frequency radio burst and satellite pulse to every militia commander from the Mediterranean to the Hindu Kush. The script of victory began to fray at the edges when the USS Abraham Lincoln, positioned just outside the Strait of Hormuz, reported what the censors called a swarm event. It wasn't the Iranian Navy. Their large frigates had been sunk within minutes by Harpoon missiles. It was the Mosquito Fleet, hundreds of unmanned explosives-laden speedboats, some no larger than a jet ski, launched from hidden coastal caves and civilian fishing ports along the Mokron coast. They didn't come in a line. They came like a cloud of locusts. The Phalanx CIWS systems on the American destroyers screamed as they melted their barrels, trying to track 300 simultaneous targets. Even the most advanced Aegis combat system has a saturation point, a mathematical limit where the computer simply cannot process the number of incoming threats fast enough. When the first suicide drone struck the hull of a billion-dollar destroyer, the bedtime story of an easy victory began to turn into a fever dream of fire and salt water. Back in Washington, the economic victory was also proving to be a phantom. The moment the first missile crossed the Iranian border, the Strait of Hormuz, the world's most vital carotid artery for energy, didn't just close, it vanished. The Iranian military had spent years seeding the seabed with smart mines that didn't just sit and wait. They moved. They communicated using low-frequency acoustic pulses. They were nightmares that could tell the difference between a neutral cargo ship and a military vessel. Global oil markets didn't just react. They suffered a massive, systemic cardiac arrest. Crude oil, which had been stable at $75 a barrel, rocketed to $140 in 4 hours. In London, Tokyo, and New York, the stock market screens turned a violent, bleeding red. Elias Thorne, a senior strategist at the Pentagon, sat in the twilight of his office, his face illuminated by the flickering glow of 3 different monitors. He looked at the map of the Middle East, which was now lit up like a Christmas tree of active hostilities. He realized that the US had won the battle of the sky, but they had triggered something far more dangerous, a war of total attrition in a world that no longer had the patience or the treasury for it. He remembered a quote from a forgotten history book. Amateurs study tactics, professionals study logistics, gods study the will to resist. We hit them, his assistant, a young captain named Sarah, whispered, looking at the satellite imagery of the smoking ruins of Tehran. The leadership is gone. The nuclear facilities are dust. Why aren't they stopping? The war should be over. Elias didn't look up from his screen. He was watching a live feed from a drone over Haifa, Israel. A barrage of 300 Hezbollah rockets, fired from mobile launchers hidden in Lebanese civilian apartment basements, was currently overwhelming the Iron Dome. He could see the explosions reflecting in the Mediterranean Sea. "Because we're fighting a ghost, Sarah," Elias replied, his voice heavy with the fatigue of a man who sees the ending of a book before the middle has been written. "We thought we were fighting a state. We're actually fighting a geography. You can't kill a geography with a Tomahawk missile. You can't bomb a belief into submission. We broke the machine, but we woke the hive." Outside the Pentagon, the first signs of domestic unrest were appearing on the news. Gas stations in Northern Virginia were seeing lines 2 miles long. People were fighting over the last gallons of premium gas. The victory was being measured not in territory gained, but in the price of bread and the heat in American homes. The US-Israel alliance had expected a sprint. They had accidentally stepped into a marathon through a minefield with the rest of the world, China, Russia, the global south, watching from the sidelines, waiting for the giant to trip over its own weight. As the second night fell, the Iranian ghost broadcasts began. Across every hijacked frequency in the region, A calm, pre-recorded voice began to read the names of every American base in range of the IRGC's remaining mobile missile units. Al-Udeid, Camp Lemonnier, Tower 22. It wasn't a threat. It was a rhythmic, haunting countdown. The lion wasn't dead. It had just stopped pretending to be asleep. The initial strikes had targeted the obvious: the military silos, the palaces, the factories. But the Iranians had been preparing for this day since 1979. They had built missile cities deep under the Zagros Mountains, reachable only by tunnels that twisted for miles through solid granite. These cities were self-sustaining, powered by geothermal energy and stocked with decades of supplies. As the American B-2 bombers returned to Diego Garcia to refuel, the mountain doors, hidden by holographic camouflage and rock face facades, slid open. The retaliation was not a blind lashing out. It was a precise, synchronized strike on the world's soft underbelly. Submarine cables in the Indian Ocean were cut by deep-sea divers. Satellite uplinks were jammed by ground-based lasers located in the middle of the Lut Desert. The digital world, the one the Americans relied on to fight their clean war, began to stutter. GPS signals in the Persian Gulf started showing ships in the middle of the desert. Communication between units became a garble of static and Persian poetry. Elias Thorne watched as the Blue Force Tracker, the digital map that showed the position of every American soldier, began to flicker and fade. "They aren't just fighting us on the ground," he murmured to the empty room. "They're erasing the ground beneath our feet." The bedtime story was shifting. It was no longer about the hero who slays the dragon. It was about the hero who realizes the dragon is the mountain itself, and every strike he lands only brings the mountain down on his own head. The first 12,000 characters of this new history were written in fire, and the ink was still wet. The world held its breath as the sun set on the second day, knowing that when it rose again, the map of the Middle East and the hierarchy of the world would never look the same. In the streets of Tel Aviv, the sirens had become a constant, low-frequency hum, a background noise to a life lived in bunkers. In the streets of Tehran, the smoke of the initial strikes mingled with the dust of the desert, creating a haze that turned the moon blood red. The victory was nowhere to be found, lost somewhere in the smoke and the static, as the first phase of the war ended not with a bang, but with a terrifying, expectant silence. The American public, initially rallied by the surgical success, began to see the true cost. This wasn't a movie. There were no credits rolling. There was only the sound of the wind through the mountain passes and the steady ticking clock of a global economy on the brink of collapse. The stage was set for the proxy storm, the second act of a tragedy that no one had bothered to rehearse. The second act of the script, the proxy storm, did not begin with a declaration of war, but with a synchronized failure of the regional status quo. By the third day of Operation Epic Fury, the tactical victory of the United States and Israel, the smoking centrifuges and the shattered radar arrays, began to look like a hollow shell. In the windowless corridors of the Pentagon, the digital maps that once showed a clear blue and red battlefield were now dissolving into a chaotic purple haze. The Lion's Sleep Protocol had transitioned into the Hydra's Awakening, and the world was about to learn that you cannot kill an ideology with a kinetic strike. In Lebanon, the silence of the first 48 hours was broken not by a single missile, but by 10,000. Hezbollah, the crown jewel of Iran's axis of resistance, had spent 2 decades preparing for this exact moment. They didn't target military bases initially. They targeted the infrastructure of psychological stability. Power plants in Haifa, water desalination facilities in Ashdod, and the fiber optic hubs of Tel Aviv were hit with a precision that suggested they had been mapped down to the last circuit breaker. The Iron Dome, once the shield of a nation, was faced with a mathematical impossibility. It was designed for rockets. It was not designed for a saturation of low-flying, terrain-hugging kamikaze drones that moved like a murmuration of starlings, weaving through the valleys of the Galilee to avoid radar detection. In the Situation Room, Elias Thorne watched the threat saturation meter climb into the red. "They're not trying to win a dogfight," he muttered, rubbing his eyes, which were bloodshot from 48 hours of caffeine and data streams. "They're trying to bankrupt the interceptors. Every Tamir missile we fire costs $50,000. Every drone they send costs $500. We are trading gold for lead, and we're running out of gold." The crisis wasn't confined to the Levant. In Iraq, the Green Zone, the fortified heart of American diplomatic presence in Baghdad, became a cage. The Popular Mobilization Forces, PMF, nominally part of the Iraqi state, but loyal to the shadow of the IRGC, didn't launch an assault. They simply walked away from their posts, allowing unidentified mortar teams to set up in the surrounding neighborhoods. The American embassy, a billion-dollar fortress, was suddenly under a constant rain of small-diameter explosives. It wasn't enough to destroy the building, but it was enough to ensure that no helicopter could land and no diplomat could leave. The US was winning in the skies over Tehran, but they were being systematically evicted from the ground in Baghdad. Further south, the Red Sea became a graveyard for global commerce. The Houthis in Yemen, long dismissed as a ragtag militia, unveiled Al-Mandab 3, anti-ship ballistic missiles, tech that shouldn't have existed in their inventory. They didn't just target American warships, they targeted any vessel flying a flag of a nation that hadn't condemned the strikes on Iran. The Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the southern gate to the Suez Canal, was effectively padlocked. Insurance rates for shipping tripled in a single afternoon. Lloyd's of London declared the entire Indian Ocean a war risk zone. Back in the United States, the bedtime story of a clean overseas war was being interrupted by the harsh reality of the supermarket shelf. Because of the closure of the Straits of Hormuz and Bab el-Mandeb, the global just-in-time supply chain began to seize up. It wasn't just the gas prices, which had now hit $7 a gallon in California. It was the microchips, the pharmaceuticals, and the grain. The American public, who had cheered the initial surgical strikes on the news, were now staring at empty shelves and skyrocketing utility bills. The victory was no longer a headline, it was a tax. Elias Thorne received a classified briefing from the Treasury Department. The numbers were terrifying. The war was costing the US economy an estimated $12 billion a day in lost productivity and increased energy costs. At that rate, the victory would cost more than the entire national debt could sustain. "We're winning the war on the map," the Treasury Secretary had whispered over a secure line. "But we're losing the war on the ledger. If this lasts another month, the dollar isn't just going to drop, it's going to evaporate." The script shifted to the mountain redoubt of the IRGC's Shadow Command in central Iran. Deep beneath the salt flats of the Dasht-e Kavir, the generals who had survived the initial decapitation strike were not mourning their fallen leader. They were watching the global fallout on flickering monitors powered by independent geothermal grids. They didn't need to defeat the US Navy in a traditional battle. They only needed to stay alive and keep the chaos engine running. Their strategy was strategic patience. They knew that the American electorate had a short attention span and a low tolerance for sacrifice. They knew that the Israeli public, living in bunkers, would eventually demand an end to the rain of fire. The Americans think in 4-year cycles. One of the Iranian commanders remarked, his voice echoing in the stone chamber. We think in centuries. They have the watches, but we have the time. The proxy storm also brought a new, terrifying element, the cyber front. On the 5th day, the soft war reached the continental United States. It wasn't a massive blackout, which would have triggered a nuclear-level response. It was subtler. The billing systems of 3 major healthcare providers were encrypted by ransomware. The scheduling software for the New York City subway system began to glitch, causing massive, unexplainable delays. Water treatment plants in small-town Ohio reported unauthorized overrides of chlorine levels. It was a death-by-1,000-cut strategy, designed to make the American citizen feel that the war was not over there, but inside their own homes, their own pockets, their own computers. In Israel, the victory felt even more precarious. Despite hundreds of sorties by the IAF, the rocket fire from Lebanon and Gaza didn't stop. It actually intensified. The axis of resistance had built metro tunnels so deep and so extensive that they were effectively immune to conventional bombing. The IDF was faced with a choice: a massive, bloody ground invasion into southern Lebanon, a repeat of the 1982 and 2006 quagmires, or watch their economy bleed out as the population stayed in shelters. The night of the 6th day brought a haunting visual to the world's television screens. A lone Iranian drone, a Shahed 136, managed to bypass the final layers of the Tel Aviv defense grid. It didn't hit a military target. It crashed into the empty plaza of the Habima Theater. The explosion was small, but the symbolism was tectonic. The invincible shield had a hole in it. The victory was a sieve. Elias Thorne stood on the balcony of the Pentagon, looking out toward the Washington Monument. The city was quiet, but the air felt charged with a static tension. He thought about the script they had written for this war, the one with the parades and the regime change, and the new, democratic Middle East. That script was a fairy tale. The real story was much darker. It was a story of a superpower that had forgotten how to fight a war that couldn't be won with a delete key. "Sir," Captain Sarah said, stepping out onto the balcony behind him. "The Chinese and Russian delegations have just issued a joint statement. They're calling for an international security zone in the Persian Gulf. They're offering to escort tankers with their own navies." Elias closed his eyes. This was the masterstroke. By protecting the oil that the US had inadvertently put at risk, China was stepping into the role of the global stabilizer. The US was being framed as the arsonist, and China was showing up with the fire truck and a bill for the water. "The trap is closed," Elias whispered. "We took the bait. We hit them so hard that we broke the world they were holding together. And now we're the only ones left to blame for the pieces." The bedtime story was no longer about a hero. It was about a giant who had swung his club so hard he had shattered the floor he was standing on. As the part ends, the first peace protests are beginning in London and Berlin, not against the Iranian regime, but against the escalation cycle. The US victory was looking less like a triumph and more like a catastrophic, self-inflicted wound. The realization that the war was not going to follow the Pentagon's carefully choreographed script arrived not with a thunderous explosion, but with the haunting, persistent hum of a subterranean frequency. By the 8th day of Operation Epic Fury, the initial adrenaline of the aerial campaign had evaporated, replaced by the cold, grey reality of the mountain shadow. In the command centers of Tel Aviv and Washington, the high-resolution satellite imagery that had once proudly displayed the wreckage of Iranian surface-to-air missile batteries was now showing something far more unsettling. Nothing. The Iranian military had effectively vanished into the earth. The victory that had been declared on day one, the supposed total destruction of the Iranian nuclear program and command structure, was being revealed as a masterpiece of deception. The facilities at Natanz and Fordo, which the B-2 Spirits had pounded into dust with GBU-57, massive ordnance penetrators, were largely decoys, elaborate, hardened honeypots designed to absorb the first wave of American fury. The real brain of the IRGC had long since moved to the Eagle 44 complexes and a network of thousands of miles of missile cities carved deep into the granite heart of the Zagros Mountains. These were not just bunkers. They were subterranean metropolises, shielded by hundreds of feet of solid rock and sophisticated electronic dampening fields that turned the most advanced American sensors into blind eyes. In the Pentagon's subterranean war room, Elias Thorne stood before a holographic projection of the Iranian plateau. The map was peppered with red dots representing suspected underground launch sites, but the dots were shifting. "They're using a rail-based shuffling system," Elias explained to the Joint Chiefs, his voice cracking from lack of sleep. "They have thousands of miles of tunnels. They can move a medium-range ballistic missile from Qom to the outskirts of Mashhad without ever surfacing. We are playing a game of whack-a-mole, where the mole has a high-speed railway, and we're trying to hit him with a sledgehammer from 10 miles up." The American victory was becoming a strategic cage. To actually win, the US would need to put boots on the ground, an invasion force of at least 500,000 troops to clear and hold a terrain that was a natural fortress. But the political appetite for a ground war in Iran was non-existent. The memory of Iraq and Afghanistan hung over the capital like a toxic fog. Even the most hawkish senators were beginning to realize that taking out Iran was a task that would require a generation of blood and a treasury that was currently bleeding out in real time. The economic war of the ledgers had entered a terminal phase. With the Strait of Hormuz blocked by ghost mines and the Saudi oil facilities at Abqaiq coming under sporadic, precision drone fire from unidentified pro-Iranian militias in Iraq, the global energy market was in a state of total collapse. In the US, the national average for gas hit $9.50 a gallon. The trucking industry, the literal circulatory system of the American economy, was grinding to a halt. Food prices in Chicago and Los Angeles spiked by 40% in a week. The victory was no longer something people watched on the news with pride. It was something they felt in their empty stomachs and freezing homes. Elias Thorne's phone buzzed with a secure message from his contact at the CIA's Economic Intelligence Branch. The message was 3 words: the yuan pivot. He felt a cold sink in his chest. While the US was focused on the mountains of Iran, China had moved. Beijing had just announced the Persian Peace Initiative, offering to provide a gold-backed digital currency for any nation willing to bypass the US dollar to purchase Iranian and Russian oil through a new land bridge pipeline system that avoided the sea lanes entirely. The US had used the dollar as a weapon for so long that the rest of the world had finally decided to build a shield against it. The victory over Tehran was inadvertently destroying the hegemony of the dollar. In Israel, the situation was becoming existential. The mountain shadow extended all the way to Lebanon. The IDF had conducted 3,000 airstrikes against Hezbollah positions, yet the rocket fire was not decreasing. It was evolving. The militants were now using Burkan, heavy rockets with half-ton warheads, launched from pop-up canisters that retracted into the ground before the smoke had even cleared. The northern half of Israel was a ghost town. 200,000 citizens were living in overcrowded shelters in the south, where the social fabric was beginning to fray. The victory promised by the government felt like a slow-motion siege. "We need a ground incursion into southern Lebanon," the Israeli chief of staff argued over a grainy video link. "We cannot stop the rain from the air. If you go in," Elias warned, "you trigger the Baghdad Protocol. The militias in Iraq and Syria will flood across the border. You'll be fighting on 3 fronts against an enemy that doesn't care about casualties. It's a meat grinder, General. You'll win every battle and lose the country." The bedtime story was now a narrative of the hollow giant. The giant, the US-Israel alliance, was throwing punches that landed on stone, while the ghost of the mountain was whispering in the world's ear. In Tehran, the IRGC's soft war department was winning the global PR battle. They weren't releasing videos of soldiers. They were releasing videos of the civilian toll of the American strikes, narrated in 30 different languages. The global south, India, Brazil, South Africa, was moving from neutral to openly hostile. The UN General Assembly saw a historic vote to strip the US of its peacekeeping authority in the region. As the 10th day of the war ended, the Shadow Command in the mountains made its most daring move. They didn't fire a missile. They didn't sink a ship. Instead, they triggered a zero-day exploit in the global SWIFT banking system. It was a cyber weapon of such complexity that it could only have been developed with the help of a major power, most likely Russia or China. For 6 hours, every cross-border financial transaction in the Western world froze. At the same moment, the ghost voice returned to the airwaves, speaking not in Persian, but in perfect, unaccented English. "To the people of the West," the voice said, echoing through the hijacked speakers of smart TVs and digital billboards. "Your leaders have told you this is a war for security. But look at your bank accounts, look at your streets, look at the horizon. You are not being protected. You are being liquidated. The mountain does not move. The giant only tires himself out until he falls." Elias Thorne stood in the center of the Situation Room, watching the red lines of the financial markets flatline on the screens. He realized that the US victory was impossible because the US was playing a game of checkmate, while the Iranians were playing a game of Go. In Go, you don't try to kill the king. You simply surround the enemy until they have no space left to breathe. The mountains were still there. The missiles were still moving. And for the first time in 80 years, the American public was starting to ask, what did we actually win? As the part ends, the first snow of March begins to fall over Washington, but there is no heat in the buildings. The giant is shivering. The mountain is silent. The story is shifting from a war of fire to a war of ice. And the US is realizing that its most powerful weapons are useless against an enemy that has already accepted the end of the world. The proxy storm, which had begun as a series of disparate irritants, evolved on the 12th day into what military historians would later call the Great Squeeze. In the cold, fluorescent-lit theater of the Pentagon's National Military Command Center, the holographic map of the Middle East was no longer a tool of strategy. It was a record of a systemic collapse. The US and Israel had anticipated a short, sharp war, a surgical removal of a regime. Instead, they had inadvertently kicked over a hornet's nest that spanned 5 time zones, and the hornets were no longer buzzing. They were biting in perfect, lethal synchronization. The squeeze began at the borders. In the north, Hezbollah moved from defensive rocket fire to probing operations. These weren't the disorganized skirmishes of the past. Under the cover of a massive 5,000 Uzero rocket-per-hour barrage that turned the skies over northern Israel into a kaleidoscopic nightmare of interceptor trails and explosions, the Radwan force, Hezbollah's elite commando units, began to bypass the tunnels. They didn't cross the border in massed formations that the Israeli Air Force could vaporize. They moved in microcells of 3 to 5 men, using the very ruins the IAF had created as cover. They were moving into the Galilee, not to take territory, but to turn the Israeli rear into a front line. Elias Thorne watched the telemetry from the Israeli Northern Command. "They're not trying to hold Metula or Kiryat Shmona," he whispered to the silence of the room. "They're trying to force the IDF to pull troops from the Iranian theater. They're creating a vacuum, but the vacuum was being filled by something even more dangerous. In Iraq, the Status of Forces Agreement became a dead letter overnight. The Popular Mobilization Forces, PMF, now acting under the unified Imam Hussein Command, began a systematic blockade of American logistics. They didn't attack the bases directly with tanks. They used the soft siege. They parked thousands of civilian vehicles on the main supply routes from Kuwait. They turned off the water and electricity to the Al-Assad airbase, claiming technical difficulties due to American cyber strikes on the regional grid. For the first time since 2003, the US military in Iraq found itself strategically orphaned, surrounded by a population that was no longer indifferent but actively hostile, and a local government that had gone into the mountains to wait for the smoke to clear. The bedtime story was taking a dark turn for the American soldier. In the script of the old wars, there was always a forward edge of the battle area. You knew where the enemy was. In the proxy storm of 2026, the enemy was the man delivering the fuel, the clerk at the gate, and the very airwaves the radios relied on. The US military's greatest strength, its technological overmatch, was being neutralized by the sheer mass of the gray zone. You cannot use a $200 million F-35 to stop a truck driver from parking his rig in the middle of a bridge. "Sir?" Captain Sarah reported, her voice trembling slightly. "The Houthis have just declared a total exclusion zone for the entire Arabian Sea. They've successfully struck a French frigate and a Singaporean tanker using Iranian-supplied Zuljana hypersonic gliders. They're not just hitting the Red Sea anymore. They've reached out and choked the Indian Ocean." Elias looked at the global shipping heat map. The dots, each representing a vessel carrying the lifeblood of the global economy, were turning around. They were fleeing toward the Cape of Good Hope, adding 3 weeks and millions of dollars in fuel costs to every journey. The victory over the Iranian nuclear program was being paid for by the collapse of the global retail and manufacturing sectors. In Washington, the political fallout was reaching a flashpoint. The president's approval rating had plummeted to 14%. The victory in Iran narrative was being drowned out by the bread riots in Baltimore. The proxy storm was designed to force an impossible choice. The US and Israel had 2 options, both of them catastrophic. Option 1. Escalation, a full-scale ground invasion of Lebanon and Iraq to clear the lines. This would require a draft in the United States and would likely trigger a general European withdrawal from the coalition. Option 2. Withdrawal. Admitting that the surgical strike had failed to achieve a strategic result, leaving a decimated Iran but a dominant axis of resistance. "It's a chess problem called Zugzwang," Elias murmured, tapping the glass of the display. "Every move we make worsens our position. If we stay, we bleed out. If we leave, we lose the century." In Israel, the squeeze was becoming visceral. The Iron Dome was failing not because of technology, but because of physics. They were running out of interceptor missiles. The manufacturing plants in the US couldn't ship the replacements fast enough because the ports were jammed or under threat. For the first time in history, the Israeli public was told to prepare for unprotected intervals, windows of time where the state could no longer guarantee the sky would be clear. The psychological impact was profound. The startup nation was becoming a bunker nation, and the exodus of the country's high-tech elite, the brain drain, began in earnest as anyone with a second passport looked for a way out. The Hydra was also showing its teeth in the West. In London, Paris, and Berlin, the proxy storm took the form of hybrid unrest. Coordinated cyber attacks on public transit coincided with massive, spontaneous protests that paralyzed the capitals. The narrative was being controlled by the Shadow Command in the Zagros Mountains. They were releasing documents, real or forged, it didn't matter, showing that the US had planned the strikes on Iran for years as a way to control the global oil price. The Global South rallied around this narrative. The US was no longer the leader of the free world. It was the international arsonist. Elias Thorne received a private memo from the Israeli Mossad. It contained a single, terrifying piece of intelligence. The decapitation strike that had supposedly killed the Iranian supreme leader had actually hit a body double. The leader was alive, and he was currently in a secure, subterranean facility in the city of Mashhad, surrounded by Chinese and Russian technical advisors. The realization hit Elias like a physical blow. The US hadn't just failed to win. They had been lured into a trap designed to demonstrate American impotence. The victory was the bait. The proxy storm was the trap snapping shut. "We need to talk about an exit strategy," Elias said, turning to the room of generals. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs, a man who had spent 40 years believing in the American century, looked at Elias with hollow eyes. "There is no exit, Elias. We've destroyed their cities, and they've destroyed our world order. How do you exit a world that doesn't want you in it anymore?" As the 12th day came to a close, the proxy storm shifted into its most lethal phase, the night of the 1,000 drones. Across every American base in the Middle East, the sky suddenly filled with the low-frequency drone of lawnmower engines. Thousands of cheap, GPS-guided suicide drones, launched from the backs of civilian pickup trucks in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen, began their slow, steady descent toward the American fortresses. The bedtime story was no longer about a hero or a giant. It was about a house of cards in a hurricane. As the drones hit their targets, the screens in the Pentagon began to flicker and go dark, one by one. The US had won the battle of the satellites, the battle of the stealth fighters, and the battle of the bunkers. But they were losing the war of the shadows. The giant was being brought down by an army of ants, and for the first time in his life, Elias Thorne felt the cold, creeping certainty that the script he was living in ended with a funeral, not for a man, but for a superpower. The part ends with the sound of a single, distant explosion echoing through the halls of the Pentagon. Not a real bomb, but the sound of the world's trust in the American shield finally cracking. The sun set over a Middle East that was more chaotic than it had been in a millennium, and the US victory was a ghost that haunted the ruins of a global dream. The true gravity of a war is rarely felt in the cockpit of a fighter jet. It is felt in the aisles of a grocery store. By the 15th day of Operation Epic Fury, the economic hemorrhage had transitioned from a theoretical risk discussed in white papers to a visceral, daily reality for the American public. The bedtime story of a distant, clean conflict had been replaced by a domestic nightmare that was rapidly eroding the social contract. In the Pentagon, Elias Thorne no longer watched the troop movements on the digital maps. He watched the National Stability Index, a dashboard that tracked inflation, energy costs, and civil unrest. The lines weren't just trending downward, they were falling off a cliff. The US dollar, for nearly a century the exorbitant privilege of the American state, was undergoing a systemic crisis. Because the Straits of Hormuz remained a dark zone where no insurer would touch a vessel, and because the proxy storm had successfully paralyzed Saudi and Emirati exports, the global oil supply had been cut by 20%. In a world built on just-in-time logistics, a 20% deficit doesn't lead to a 20% price increase. It leads to a total breakdown. Crude oil had stabilized at a staggering $210 a barrel. In the United States, this translated to a national average of $12 for a gallon of gasoline. The victory in Iran was now the bankruptcy of the American suburb. In the Situation Room, the Treasury Secretary sat opposite Elias, his face the color of parchment. "The Fed is out of ammunition, Elias. We can't raise interest rates to fight inflation because the debt service would consume the entire federal budget. We can't print more money because the global demand for the dollar is evaporating. For the first time in history, the world is looking at the American shield and seeing a liability, not an asset." The yuan pivot had become a tidal wave. While the US military was bogged down in a multi-front war of attrition with Iranian-backed militias, Beijing had officially launched the Global Resilience Fund. It was a digital currency backed by a basket of commodities, oil, gold, and rare earth minerals, that allowed any nation to trade without touching the US banking system. By day 16, Brazil, India, and even traditionally Western-aligned nations like Turkey and Indonesia had signed onto the pivot. The US victory over Tehran had achieved the impossible. It had unified the global South in a financial rebellion against the West. The hemorrhage was not just financial, it was psychological. In the script of American history, the home front was always a place of production and unity. But in 2026, the home front was a place of fracture. Because the US power grid had been hit by a series of denial-of-service attacks, subtle, persistent glitches that caused rolling blackouts in major cities, the American public was literally in the dark. The ghost voice of the Iranian Psychological Operations Units was now being broadcast via high-altitude balloons drifting over the Midwest, bypassing the jammed satellite networks. "Why are you cold?" the voice would ask in a soft, Midwestern accent. "Why is your bank account empty?" "Because your leaders decided that a mountain in Iran was more important than your family's table. They won the war in the sky. Are you winning the war for your dinner?" In Washington, the domestic unrest turned violent. The bread riots that had started in the inner cities spread to the affluent suburbs as supply chains for basic pharmaceuticals and imported electronics collapsed. The National Guard was deployed to protect distribution centers, creating the optics of a country at war with itself. The victory was being measured in the number of American soldiers patrolling American streets. "We have to stop the bleeding," Elias said during a midnight briefing with the president. "The tactical gains in Iran are being neutralized by the strategic collapse at home. We've destroyed their navy, their air force, and their leadership. But we can't occupy the country, and we can't stop the proxies. We are winning the battle for Tehran and losing the battle for Cleveland." The president, a man who looked like he had aged 10 years in 2 weeks, stared at the flickering monitors. "If we stop now, if we withdraw, The world sees us as a defeated power. Israel is already on the brink. If we pull back our carrier groups to protect our own shores, the axis of resistance will finish what we started. The bedtime story had reached its most painful chapter, the choice between the ally and the self. Israel was indeed on the brink. The economic hemorrhage that was even more acute. With the ports closed and the workforce in bunkers, the Israeli GDP was shrinking by 5% every week. The Iron Dome was no longer a shield. It was a memory of a time when the world was predictable. The US was being forced to choose between a Lend-Lease program to keep Israel alive or using those same resources to prevent a total economic collapse at home. The Shadow Command in the Zagros Mountains understood this perfectly. They didn't need to sink an American carrier. They only needed to wait for the American taxpayer to realize they were paying for their own decline. Every Tomahawk missile fired was a school not built. Every gallon of jet fuel burned was a grocery bill doubled. The Iranians were no longer fighting a military war. They were fighting a war of relative exhaustion. On the 18th day, the final fracture occurred. The European Union, led by a desperate France and a pragmatically cold Germany, announced a separate peace. They would lift all sanctions on Iran in exchange for an immediate resumption of oil and gas flows through the northern pipelines. The Western coalition had shattered. The US and Israel were alone, standing in the ruins of a global order they had spent 80 years building. Elias Thorne walked through the darkened halls of the Pentagon, his footsteps echoing like a funeral march. He thought about the script he had helped write, the one where the bad actor was removed and the world became a safer place. He realized that they had treated the world like a machine, where you could simply replace a broken part. They hadn't realized that the world was an organism, and by cutting out the cancer of the Iranian regime, they had triggered a systemic organ failure. "Sir," Captain Sarah said, meeting him at the entrance to the command center. "The Chinese Naval Task Force has just entered the Persian Gulf. They're flying a UN humanitarian flag. They've told our commanders that any strike on Iranian territory from this point on will be viewed as an attack on an international peace mission." The economic hemorrhage had led to a geopolitical eviction. The US had won the war, but it had lost its place as the landlord of the planet. The giant was bleeding, the neighbors were moving out, and the mountain was still there, silent and immovable. The part ends with Elias standing on the roof of the Pentagon, looking at the city of Washington. The lights were out. The only glow came from the fires of a protest several miles away and the cold, indifferent stars above. The victory was complete. Iran was a ruin. But as Elias felt the bite of the March wind, he knew the truth. They had won the war, and in doing so, they had lost everything else. The transition from a world of light to a world of static happened at 3:14 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on the 19th day. In the script of modern warfare, this was the 0 hour, the moment when the cyber front ceased to be a peripheral annoyance and became the primary theater of operations. For years, the US and its allies had boasted of full-spectrum dominance, a term that suggested the digital world was just another territory to be conquered, like the air or the sea. But as Elias Thorne stood in the center of the Pentagon's Cyber Command, he watched the screens turn from data-rich maps into a blinding, rhythmic pulse of white noise. The victory was being erased by a ghost in the machine. And for the first time in his career, Elias realized that the most advanced military in history was effectively illiterate in the language of the New World. The Iranian soft war units had not been destroyed in the initial strikes. While their physical headquarters in Tehran had been reduced to craters, Their operators had long since scattered. They were working from basement apartments in Istanbul, from server farms in the suburbs of Moscow, and from educational research centers in Shanghai. They were bolstered by the volunteers of the Digital Dawn, a collective of hackers from across the global south who viewed the American strikes as the final gasp of a dying empire. Together, they had launched a polymorphic strike. It wasn't a single virus or a brute force attack. It was a self-evolving code that didn't target the military's hardened NIPRNet or SEPAnet. Instead, it targeted the connective tissue of Western life, the invisible protocols that allowed a modern society to breathe. The first to go was the Global Logistics Tracking System, the Navis and Orion protocols that managed the flow of goods across the planet. In an instant, the millions of shipping containers that were the lifeblood of the global economy became lost. The digital manifests that told a ship in the middle of the Atlantic what was in its hold and where it was supposed to go simply vanished. It was a digital lobotomy. Simultaneously, the smart electrical grids of the American Eastern Seaboard began to hunt, a technical term for a frequency oscillation that causes transformers to physically vibrate until they explode. The victory over Tehran was being answered by a darkness that stretched from Boston to Charlotte, a silence so profound it felt heavy. "They aren't trying to hack our missiles," Elias shouted over the sound of emergency sirens that were now echoing through the Pentagon's ventilation system. "They're hacking our reality. They're making it impossible for us to live in the world we created." He looked at a technician, a young woman named Miller, who was frantically typing commands into a terminal that seemed to be spitting back gibberish. "Can we isolate the source?" "There is no source, sir," Miller replied, her voice bordering on hysteria. "It's coming from everywhere. It's using the Internet of Things. Every smart fridge, every connected thermostat, every industrial sensor in the country is participating in the DDoS. We're being attacked by our own appliances. The calls are coming from inside the house." The bedtime story had moved into the Hall of Mirrors. In Israel, the cyberfront was even more devastating. The Iron Dome and David Sling systems relied on a seamless integration of radar, satellite data, and interceptor telemetry. On the morning of the 20th day, that integration failed. It wasn't that the missiles weren't firing. It was that the radars began seeing ghost swarms. The screens showed thousands of incoming projectiles where there were none, and, more terrifyingly, nothing where there were real ones. The shield had become a blindfold. The psychological toll was catastrophic. The belief in technological salvation, the core of the Israeli security doctrine, shattered in a single afternoon. People stood on their balconies in Tel Aviv, looking at a clear blue sky, only to hear the roar of an explosion, a block away that their phones had told them didn't exist. Back in the US, the domestic cyber front took a more insidious form, the identity liquidation. For 3 hours, the databases of the 3 largest American banks were not deleted, but shuffled. The code didn't steal money. It simply swapped account balances and ownership titles. People logged into their banking apps to find they had $10 million, or zero, or someone else's mortgage. The fundamental trust in the concept of value and ownership evaporated. The victory in Iran seemed like a cruel joke to a man who could no longer prove he owned his own car or had enough money to buy a loaf of bread. "Sir," Captain Sarah reported, her face lit by the sickly green glow of a backup tablet that was struggling to maintain a connection. "The ghost voice is back. It's not on the radio anymore. It's bypassed the National Emergency Alert System. It's on every smart device in the country. It's in the elevators, the hospitals, the car consoles. It's everywhere. The voice was no longer the aggressive, revolutionary chant of the first few days. It was pitying. It was the voice of a parent explaining a hard truth to a child. "You thought your power was in your machines," the voice whispered through the speakers of the Pentagon's own Situation Room. "But your machines are just mirrors of your greed. You broke our homes with fire. We are breaking your world with a thought. Who is the superpower now? The one with the empty sky, or the one with the empty screen? You can bomb our cities into the Stone Age, but we have lived in the stones for a long time. You, however, you cannot live without the light." The cyber front revealed the ultimate systemic vulnerability of the US-Israel alliance. They were too advanced to win a war of total disruption. They were a high-resolution, power-fighting a low-resolution war. Iran had spent 40 years learning how to live without the grid, without the global bank, without the cloud. They were a society built on the physical, the mountain, the bazaar, the underground tunnel, the face-to-face handoff. The US was a society built on the digital, the credit score, the GPS-coordinated harvest, the just-in-time pharmaceutical delivery. By attacking the digital, Iran wasn't just hitting a target. They were hitting the very definition of American life in the 21st century. Elias Thorne looked at the holographic globe. The blue zones of American influence were flickering out like dying embers in a cold wind. The yuan pivot was no longer just a financial shift. It was now the only functioning digital infrastructure left in the world. Beijing was offering digital sanctuaries, secure, cloud-based services, and satellite internet for any country that agreed to digital neutrality and signed the new Eurasian Connectivity Pact. The US victory had pushed the world into a new era where the information superhighway was being paved by China, and the US was a roadkill on its own invention. "We need to go kinetic," the Air Force Chief of Staff argued, his face contorted in a mask of frustration as he slammed his fist on the mahogany table. "If they're using Chinese servers to attack us, we hit the servers. We hit the undersea cables. We take the whole internet down. If we're going dark, the whole world is going dark with us." "If we do that," Elias replied, his voice a cold, terrifying whisper that silenced the room, "we finish the job for them. We are a digital species, General. We can't survive in the analog age we're trying to bomb Iran back into. They've already adapted to the dark. Their command structure is runners on motorcycles and handwritten notes. Our command structure is 1 billion lines of code that are currently being rewritten by an enemy we can't see. We are trying to fight a ghost with a bayonet." The narrative of the victory was now being written by the victims of the cyberfront. In London, the London Stock Exchange remained closed for the 5th consecutive day, not because of a physical threat, but because the software that cleared trades had been infected with a logic bomb that triggered every time a transaction was attempted. In Paris, the automated metro system had been shut down after 2 trains were nearly sent into a head-on collision by a spoofed signal. The European public, already reeling from the energy crisis, was now facing a total breakdown of civil order. The US was no longer seen as the protector of the West. It was seen as the infected patient zero of a digital plague. The cyberfront also reached the battlefield in a way the Pentagon hadn't rehearsed. The F-35 Lightning II, the most expensive weapon system in history, was essentially a flying computer. On the 21st day, during a mission over the Zagros Mountains, 3 Israeli F-35s experienced a sensor fusion failure. The pilots reported that their displays were showing friendly targets as hostile and vice versa. They were forced to jettison their payloads into the desert and returned to base using manual navigation and dead reckoning, skills that had been neglected in the age of GPS. The overmatch was gone. The technological gap that the US relied on to keep its pilots safe had been closed not by a better plane, but by a better line of code. As the part ends, a scene of eerie, suffocating stillness settles over the Western world. In New York City, the lights of Times Square have gone black, replaced by a low, red emergency glow from battery-operated lanterns. There are no cars on the streets because the GPS-dependent traffic systems have failed, and the smart engines of modern vehicles have been remotely bricked by a firmware update that never should have happened. Thousands of people stand in the darkness of the canyons of Manhattan, looking up at the sky, waiting for a sign of the victory their leaders promised. But there is no victory to be seen. There is only the moon, cold and indifferent, and the realization that the world has changed. In the mountains of central Iran, in a dusty, subterranean room that smells of ozone and old tea, a technician clicks a single mouse button. Halfway across the world, the water pumps for the city of Las Vegas stop turning. There are no explosions, no fire, no epic fury. Just the sound of a world slowly, methodically grinding to a halt. Elias Thorne walked out of the command center and into the hallway. The backup generators were humming, a low vibrating sound that felt like a headache. He looked at his watch, but the digital display was a jumble of random characters. He realized then that the US had won every battle that mattered in the 20th century, but they were losing the only war that mattered in the 21st. The giant wasn't being killed by a sword. He was being unplugged from the life support system he had built for himself. "We thought we were the authors of this story," Elias whispered to the shadows of the hallway. "But we're just the characters, and the writer just decided to end the chapter." The part concludes with the sound of a single, distant explosion echoing through the darkened streets of Washington. Not a bomb, but a massive electrical transformer finally giving up the ghost. The US victory was a masterpiece of military science, but it was being defeated by the simple, brutal physics of a connected world that had decided it no longer wanted to be connected to the giant. The sun set on the 21st day, and for the first time in nearly 100 years, the American capital was truly, terrifyingly dark. The desperation that precedes a collapse is often mistaken for a final surge of strength. By the 23rd day of Operation Epic Fury, the United States and Israel found themselves in a strategic cul-de-sac. The surgical air campaign had failed to force a surrender. The proxy storm was devouring the Levant, and the cyber front had plunged the Western domestic front into a pre-industrial twilight. In a windowless bunker beneath Tel Aviv, the decision was made to play the final, most dangerous card in the deck, the quagmire of Com. It was a ground incursion designed to seize the holy city and the hardened nuclear facilities nearby, a move intended to shock the Iranian leadership into a ceasefire. But as Elias Thorne watched the first divisions of the 101st Airborne and the Israeli Golani Brigade cross the border, he knew they weren't marching toward a victory. They were marching into a digestive system. The geography of central Iran is a nightmare designed by a vengeful god. It is a landscape of jagged salt flats, razor-sharp granite ridges, and Kavir deserts that can swallow a tank in minutes. As the coalition forces pushed inland from the Gulf and across the border from Iraq, the bedtime story took on the quality of a fever dream. The Iranian military didn't meet them in the open with tanks or infantry lines. Instead, the terrain itself became the combatant. The roads, the few that existed, had been pre-mined with seismic charges that didn't just explode. They triggered massive rock slides in the narrow mountain passes. An entire column of American Bradley fighting vehicles was buried in seconds near the city of Khurramabad, not by a missile, but by the mountain it was driving through. The victory was being ground down by the simple, brutal physics of the Iranian plateau. In the Pentagon's subterranean war room, Elias Thorne stood before a low-light satellite feed of the Crom approach. "They're using thermal cloaking on a massive scale," he noted, his voice sounding hollow. "Our drones are looking for heat signatures, but the Iranians have built their defenses into the geothermal vents of the salt flats. They're invisible to our sensors because they're the same temperature as the Earth. We're sending our boys into a dead zone, where the technology we spent trillions on is as useful as a flashlight without batteries." The coalition's advance was slow, painful, and bloody. For every mile gained, the cost was measured in lives and scorched metal. The Iranian Ghost Command had implemented a scorched earth policy, but with a 21st century twist. As they retreated, they didn't just burn crops, they poisoned the digital infrastructure. Every cell tower the Americans captured was a Trojan horse, broadcasting signals that fried the coalition's localized communication nets. Every water station was rigged with chemical sensors that would dump toxins into the supply if the occupier's biometric signature was detected. It was a war of environmental denial. "Sir," Captain Sarah said, her eyes fixed on a casualty report that seemed to grow longer with every refresh. "The 1st Marine Division is reporting high-intensity insurgency in the streets of Iraq. They're not fighting soldiers. They're fighting sieve mill cells, teachers, shopkeepers, students, who have been trained for this for 40 years. They're using EIEDs, explosives that are triggered by the electromagnetic pulse of our own jammers. Our defense systems are literally setting off their bombs." The quagmire of Qom was the ultimate realization of why a US victory was impossible. To hold Iran, you have to occupy it. To occupy it, you have to break the spirit of 85 million people who view the invasion as a holy struggle. In the streets of the villages leading to Qom, the coalition forces found no one to surrender to. They found empty houses, rigged doors, and a silence that was more terrifying than gunfire. The victory was a phantom that stayed just 10 miles ahead, disappearing into the dust of the salt flats every time they reached for it. Back in Israel, the ground war in the north had turned into a static meat grinder. The IDF had pushed 5 kilometers into southern Lebanon, only to find that the Hezbollah Metro, the sprawling network of underground fortresses, was deeper and more complex than anything they had encountered in Gaza. The Israeli public, already exhausted by weeks in bunkers, began to see the first notification officers knocking on doors. The victory was being traded for a generation of young men, and the math didn't add up. The economic hemorrhage had made it impossible to sustain a long-term occupation. Elias Thorne received a secure physical dispatch, not a digital one, from a deep cover asset in Tehran. It was a single photograph. It showed the Iranian supreme leader standing in a garden, holding a piece of fruit. In the background, clearly visible, were the snow-capped peaks of the Elbrus Mountains. He wasn't in a bunker. He wasn't dead. He was in the capital, walking under the noses of the American stealth drones that supposedly owned the sky. "They're mocking us," Elias whispered, showing the photo to the Joint Chiefs. "We've dropped more ordnance on this country than was dropped in all of World War II, and their leadership is having tea in the garden. We're bombing the past. They're living in the future." The quagmire also took a toll on the coalition's morale. The American soldier, trained for high-tech, rapid dominance warfare, found himself in a medieval siege. The high-altitude bombers couldn't see the snipers in the salt caves. The the smart missiles couldn't find the bicycle-mounted couriers who were coordinating the ambushes. The US military was a Ferrari, being asked to win a race through a swamp. It was only a matter of time before the engine seized. On the 25th day, the storm of salt began. A massive, unseasonal dust storm, amplified by the environmental damage of the bombing campaign, rolled across the Iranian plateau. It wasn't just sand. It was caustic, salty dust from the dried lakes that fouled jet engines and blinded the satellite optics. For 72 hours, the coalition was dark. No air support, no case evac, no God's eye view. During those 72 hours, the Shadow Command launched its counteroffensive. Not with a mass charge, but with the Night of the Long Knives. Thousands of small decentralized units moved through the dust, using the salt blindness of the Americans to get within bayonet range. It was brutal, primitive, and horrifyingly effective. When the dust finally cleared, the coalition had lost 3,000 men and 20% of its armor. They hadn't lost a battle. They had been digested by the geography. "We have to pull back," Elias said at the next NSC meeting. "If we stay in the interior, we lose the army. Com is a graveyard, not a target. We're trying to seize a holy city in a country that has turned the very ground into a weapon of mass destruction." The president looked at the maps. The red zones of Iranian control were actually expanding behind the American lines. "If we retreat now, Elias, the story ends. The American era ends." The story ended the moment we thought we could win a war against a mountain, Elias replied. "The only question now is whether we survive the ending." As the part concludes, the screen shows a long, winding column of American tanks and trucks, beginning a slow, battered retreat from the outskirts of Com. The sun is setting, turning the salt flats into a blinding, shimmering white that looks like a shroud. In the distance, on the ridges of the Zagros, the Iranian flags are being raised, not by an army that won a battle, but by a people who simply waited for the intruder to tire himself out. The US victory was a dream that had died in the salt. The giant was limping back toward the sea, leaving behind a trail of burning wreckage and a shattered reputation. The quagmire had done what the missiles couldn't. It had proven that the giant was mortal, and that the earth itself was loyal to the ghost. The final shot of the part is a single American helmet, half buried in the shifting salts of the Dashti Kavir. A small, local lizard crawls over it, basking in the last heat of the day. The victory was nowhere to be found. Only the wind, the salt, and the silence of the mountain remained. The retreat from the outskirts of Com was not just a military movement. It was the funeral procession of the unipolar world. By the 28th day of Operation Epic Fury, the quagmire had done its work. The US and Israeli forces, battered by the storm of salt and the relentless erosion of their technological edge, had withdrawn to defensive perimeters along the coast and the Iraqi border. It was in this moment of exhausted stillness that the script shifted from the kinetic to the tectonic. Part 8. The diplomatic deadlock began not with a missile, but with a peace proposal that felt more like an eviction notice. In the high-ceilinged halls of the United Nations, which had been bypassed and ignored during the initial strikes, the air was suddenly charged with a new, cold reality. China and Russia, having spent the last month as concerned observers, while quietly facilitating the Yuan pivot and the cyber front, officially stepped onto the stage. They didn't come as combatants, but as the guarantors of global stability. Beijing announced a Silk Road truce. The terms were simple and devastating: an immediate ceasefire, the total withdrawal of all foreign forces from Iranian soil, and the establishment of an international energy security zone, managed by a coalition of Eurasian powers. Notably absent from the list of invited managers, the United States and the United Kingdom. In the Pentagon, Elias Thorne watched the live broadcast of the Chinese foreign minister standing alongside the Russian and Indian delegations. "They're not asking for our permission," Elias said to the empty Situation Room. "They're presenting a fait accompli. They've waited for us to empty our magazines and our treasury, and now they're showing up to buy the ruins." The diplomatic deadlock was a masterpiece of strategic patience. The US found itself in an impossible position. To reject the peace proposal meant continuing a war that was bankrupting the domestic front and destroying the military's morale. To accept it meant admitting that the American century had ended in a salt flat in central Iran. The victory was now a binary choice between a slow death and a sudden, humiliating demotion. Back in Washington, the political home front had reached a breaking point. The bread riots had evolved into a sustained anti-escalation movement that crossed all party lines. The images of American tanks being towed away by Iranian tractors, a visual echo of the Ukraine conflict, but with the roles reversed, had broken the public's will. The narrative of defending democracy couldn't survive $15 gas and a collapsing banking system. The bedtime story was being interrupted by the sound of the American public demanding a different book. "We have to veto the UN resolution," the Secretary of State argued during a heated NSC meeting. "If we let this pass, we are effectively handing the keys to the Middle East to Beijing." "With what leverage?" Elias countered, his voice sharp with the clarity of the defeated. "Our carriers are currently struggling to stay supplied because the global logistics net is still infected with the Iranian zero-day virus. Our allies in Europe have already signed the Nord Stream 3 agreement with Moscow to keep their lights on. We are holding a royal flush in a game where everyone else has decided to play bridge. The rules have changed while we were busy aiming our lasers." The deadlock wasn't just in the UN. It was inside the US-Israel alliance itself. Israel, facing an existential threat from the Hezbollah metro and a domestic economy in freefall, felt betrayed by the talk of a US withdrawal. In a desperate move to regain leverage, the Israeli cabinet leaked intelligence suggesting they were prepared to use the Jericho option, a veiled reference to their nuclear triad, if the Silk Road Truce forced them back to the 1967 borders without security guarantees. This was the deadlock's most terrifying moment. The world held its breath as the surgical war threatened to turn into a final war. But even here, the Iranian Shadow Command had a countermove. They didn't threaten a nuclear response. Instead, they released a digital audit of the Israeli nuclear command and control system, showing that the cyber front had already penetrated the silos. The deterrent was revealed to be a digital brick. Elias Thorne felt a sense of vertigo. "They've neutralized the nuclear option without firing a shot," he whispered. "They didn't build a better bomb. They built a better off switch." The diplomatic theater moved to Muscat, Oman, where the ghost voice of Iran finally took a human form. The Iranian-led negotiator, a man who had supposedly been killed in the first day's strike, appeared on camera, looking calm and impeccably dressed. He didn't gloat. He simply read a list of requirements for regional integration. He spoke of a Middle East where the US was a valued trading partner, but no longer the regional sheriff. It was a polite way of saying the era of American hegemony was over. The victory was now being redefined in the American media. The spin doctors began using phrases like strategic realignment and regional devolution, They were trying to frame the retreat as a choice, a way to pivot to the Pacific. But the world saw the truth. The US had swung its great hammer at a ghost, and the momentum of the swing had pulled the giant off his feet. On the 30th day, the deadlock was broken by a single seismic event. Saudi Arabia, the cornerstone of the petrodollar system for 50 years, officially joined the Eurasian Connectivity Pact. They announced that they would begin accepting multiple currencies for oil, effectively ending the dollar's status as the world's reserve currency. The economic hemorrhage of Part 5 had become a total system failure. Elias Thorne stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. The city of Washington was quiet, the usual roar of traffic silenced by the fuel shortages. He looked up at the statue of Lincoln and thought about the house divided. The war in Iran hadn't unified the country. It had revealed the cracks. The US victory was a hollow shell, a trophy won in a game that no longer mattered. "Sir," Captain Sarah said, appearing beside him. She was no longer in uniform. She was in civilian clothes, like many at the Pentagon who had simply stopped showing up. "The President is going to sign the Muscat Accord tonight. We're pulling out, all of it. Iraq, Syria, the Gulf. We're going home." Elias nodded. "Home. It's a nice word. I wonder if we'll recognize it when we get there." The part ends with a shot of the UN Security Council. The US ambassador is seen slowly lowering his hand, having declined to exercise the veto. The Silk Road truce passes 14-0, with one abstention. The camera pans out to show the world map. The blue zones of American influence are being replaced by a complex, interlocking web of Eurasian corridors. The giant is being ushered to the exit, not with a shove, but with a polite, firm hand on the shoulder. The final image is of the Strait of Hormuz. The first tanker to pass through the mines is not an American-flagged ship or a Western-insured vessel. It is a Chinese VLCC, escorted by an Iranian frigate that was supposed to have been sunk weeks ago. The victory was a ghost. The reality was a new master. The transition from Operation Epic Fury to Operation Homecoming was not marked by parades or the flying of mission accomplished banners. Instead, it was defined by the sound of heavy machinery grinding in reverse. By the 35th day, the US and Israeli high commands had entered the phase of the hollow win. On paper, the military objectives had been met. The Iranian nuclear infrastructure was a series of glass-lined craters. The IRGC's surface fleet was non-existent, and the upper echelons of the regime had been liquidated multiple times over. Yet, as the final American transport planes lifted off from the scorched runways of the interior, the atmosphere was one of profound, quiet defeat. The victory was a hollow shell, a trophy made of ash that disintegrated the moment it was touched. Elias Thorne stood in the center of the Eagle's Nest, a temporary command outpost on the coast of the Persian Gulf, watching the horizon. The sky was no longer filled with the roar of F-35s. It was filled with the low, ominous hum of Iranian surveillance kites, cheap, high-altitude balloons that the IRGC had launched the moment the American jammers were powered down. They were the new masters of the airspace, not through speed, but through persistence. "We destroyed their centers of gravity," the theater commander, General Vance, said, staring at a screen that showed the final troop withdrawals from the Arak region. "We hit every target on the list. We won the war, Elias. So why does it feel like we're the ones surrendering?" "Because we were fighting a map, General, and they were fighting a timeline," Elias replied. He held a tablet that displayed the new rial exchange rate. While the US dollar was struggling to stabilize against a basket of Eurasian currencies, the Iranian economy now fully integrated into the Chinese Silk Road digital ledger, was already showing signs of a phoenix recovery. The US had bombed the 20th century Iran, but in doing so, they had cleared the way for a 21st century Iran that didn't need the West to function. The hollow win was most visible in the cities the coalition had liberated. In the provincial capitals, where American flags had briefly flown, the local populations didn't offer flowers or gratitude. They offered a cold, vibrating hostility. The victory had brought no stability, only a vacuum. As the US withdrew, that vacuum was being filled not by pro-Western Democrats, but by the shadow councils, the very same IRGC cells that had supposedly been decapitated. They emerged from the mountains and the basements like a tide, reclaiming the streets before the dust from the American helicopters had even settled. In Israel, the hollow win felt like a slow-motion catastrophe. The Hezbollah metro in the north remained largely intact despite a month of bunker-busting strikes. The ceasefire, brokered in Muscat, had forced a frozen conflict line that left the Galilee a no-man's land. The Israeli startup nation was facing a reset reality. The foreign investment that had been the lifeblood of the economy was diverted to safer hubs in Singapore and Riyadh. The victory over the Iranian nuclear threat had been achieved, but at the cost of the nation's social and economic insulation. Israel was no longer an island of Western prosperity. It was a fortress in a desert that had suddenly become very, very small. Back in Washington, the hollow win was being sold as a strategic pivot. The president gave a televised address from the Oval Office, his voice thin and strained. He spoke of degrading the threat and bringing our brave men and women home. But the American public wasn't looking at the teleprompter. They were looking at their utility bills and their 401ks. The war had cost $4 trillion in direct spending and an estimated $12 trillion in lost global market share. The victory had effectively ended the American middle class's era of cheap energy and undisputed global mobility. The story we told ourselves was about a hero slaying a dragon, Elias wrote in his final report to the National Security Council. But we found out the dragon was a symbiotic part of the cave. By killing the dragon, we brought the roof down on our own heads. We have won a region that no longer recognizes our currency, our values, or our right to be there. The most haunting aspect of the hollow win was the realization of what had been left behind. The axis of resistance was no longer a ragtag group of proxies. They had been forged in the fire of epic fury into a unified, battle-hardened military bloc. They had seen the best the US and Israel had to offer: the hypersonics, the stealth, the cyber warfare, and they had survived it. They had learned the giant's rhythm. In the hollow win, the US hadn't defeated its enemies, it had trained them. Elias received a final message from his counterpart in the Iranian Shadow Command. It wasn't encrypted. It was a simple video file. It showed a group of Iranian children playing in the ruins of an American-made Humvee in a village near Shiraz. They weren't angry. They were laughing. The voiceover was a single sentence in Farsi, translated at the bottom of the screen. "Thank you for the steel. We will use it to build the next world." The hollow win was also a diplomatic graveyard. The European Union, having secured its separate peace in Part 5, was now openly debating the strategic autonomy of Europe, moving away from the NATO framework that had defined the post-World War II era. The victory in Iran had been the catalyst for the final fragmentation of the West. The US was no longer the leader of the free world. It was a North American fortress, isolated and inward-looking. As the sun set on the 38th day, Elias Thorne walked out of the Pentagon for the last time. He didn't take his security clearance badge. He left it on the desk. He looked at the Potomac River, which reflected the flickering lights of a city still struggling with rolling blackouts. The bedtime story was over. The giant was home, but the house felt empty. The victory was a heavy weight in his pocket that felt like a stone. "We did it, didn't we?" Sarah asked, meeting him at the bottom of the steps. She looked older, her eyes reflecting the weariness of 1,000 lost data streams. "The nuclear program is gone. The regime is crippled. We won." Elias looked at her, a sad, knowing smile touching his lips. "Yes, Sarah. We won. We won so much that there's nothing left for us to do but watch the others take the stage. We won the war of the past. They just won the war of the future." The part ends with a shot of the Victory Monument being planned for the National Mall. In the artist's rendering, it is a magnificent, towering structure of glass and steel. But as the camera pans back, the reality is a muddy construction site where the workers have walked off the job because they haven't been paid in weeks. The hollow win was a masterpiece of military planning and a disaster of human understanding. The giant was standing in the center of the world, holding his trophy, and for the first time in history, no one was looking at him. The final image is of the Iranian plateau, seen from a high-altitude satellite. The craters are there. The scars of the epic fury are visible, but so are the new lights, thousands of them, stretching toward the east, toward the new Silk Road, toward a world that had moved on while the giant was busy fighting the ghost. The final chapter of this history did not begin with a treaty signed on the deck of a majestic battleship, nor was it marked by the triumphant return of a conquering hero to a cheering capital. Instead, it was defined by a quiet, almost imperceptible update to the digital maps of the world's financial and geopolitical reality. By the 45th day, the smoke over the Zagros Mountains had finally cleared, leaving behind a sky that felt thinner, colder, and profoundly unfamiliar. The victory that had been promised was now a historical footnote, a tactical achievement that had been swallowed by a strategic tectonic shift so vast that most were still struggling to comprehend its scope. As the last American combat units boarded the transport ships in the port of Aqaba, the world they were leaving behind was no longer the one they had entered. The story was over, and the morning that followed was bright, harsh, and dominated by a different sun. Elias Thorne sat on a wooden bench in a small, neglected park in Alexandria, Virginia. From this vantage point, he could see the silhouette of the Pentagon across the gray water of the Potomac, its massive, five-sided shape, looking less like a command center and more like a limestone fossil of a bygone era. He held a physical paper map in his hands, a relic from a time before the Great Blackout had made digital trust a luxury few could afford. On it, he had traced the new borders of global influence with a red pen, his hand steady despite the fatigue that lived in his marrow. The lines no longer radiated outward from Washington to the rest of the planet. Instead, they converged on a new, jagged axis, a line stretching from Moscow, diving through the rebuilt heart of Tehran, and anchoring firmly in the glass towers of Beijing. The new order was not a conspiracy or a sudden revolution. It was simply a change in the global weather. The United States and Israel had spent their strength fighting the ghost of a regime, only to find that the ghost was the wind itself. They had won every engagement, destroyed every target, and neutralized every leader. Yet they found themselves standing in a world that had moved on without them. The victory was a vacuum. In the streets of Tehran, the reconstruction was already beginning with a speed that defied Western logic. It wasn't being funded by the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund. The towering cranes that now dominated the Iranian skyline bore the logos of Chinese state-owned enterprises. The Marshall Plan of 2026 was being written in Mandarin and financed by a currency that didn't need the approval of the New York Stock Exchange. Iran had been bombed back into the 20th century, only to be fast-tracked into the 21st by an Eastern alliance that viewed the American strikes as a necessary, if violent, clearance of the old guard. In Israel, the reality was even more claustrophobic. The Muscat Accord had created a security corridor that was patrolled not by American peacekeepers, but by a joint Russian-Turkish-Egyptian force that viewed the region through a lens of pragmatic stability rather than ideological alliance. Israel remained a military powerhouse, its technology still the envy of the world, but its strategic depth had vanished. It was a nation-state that had been forced to become a city-state, a high-tech fortress surrounded by a region that had successfully decoupled from the Western economic engine. The victory over the Iranian nuclear threat was technically absolute. The facilities were indeed dust, but the knowledge had survived in the minds of the dispersed scientists, and the threat had simply shifted from the physical to the existential. The shield was still there, but the world it protected was smaller, poorer, and more isolated than it had been in 100 years. Back in the United States, the homecoming was a somber, muted affair. The soldiers returned to a country that was fundamentally transformed. The devaluation of the dollar had become a permanent feature of the landscape, not a temporary shock. The United States was no longer the world's consumer of last resort. It was a nation forced to live within its own shrinking means for the first time since the end of the Second World War. The political fracture that had begun during the energy riots had hardened into a permanent domestic deadlock. The giant had come home to find his house had been divided, his influence spent, and his credit card cancelled by a world that was tired of his debts. Elias looked at his map one last time, his eyes lingering on the empty spaces where the old alliances used to be. He noticed a young man sitting on a nearby bench, still wearing his faded, desert-tan fatigue jacket, staring at a smartphone that was struggling to find a signal in a city where the grid was still a patchwork of failures. The young man looked weary, his eyes reflecting the 1,000-yard stare of someone who had seen the victory up close and found it wanting. "Where were you?" Elias asked softly, his voice barely carrying over the rustle of the wind. The soldier looked up, his face etched with the fine white dust of the Iranian salt flats, a dust that seemed to have settled into his very skin. "I was at the salt flats, near Qom. We took the ridge. We held it for 3 days under a sky that felt like it was made of iron. They told us we won." He looked back at his dead phone, the glass screen reflecting the grey sky. "But then we got the order to leave. We left everything there. My best friend is still in that salt. And now I'm back here, and the lights in my apartment don't work, and the grocery store is empty, and I can't even afford the bus to go see my mother in Ohio." The soldier's voice wasn't angry. It was just hollow, a vessel drained of its purpose. "What did we win, sir? Everyone keeps saying we won. I saw the footage of the bunkers exploding. I saw the ships sink. But it feels like we're the ones who lost." Elias didn't have a lie ready. He looked at the map in his lap, a map that showed a world where the United States was merely one power among many, where the rules-based international order had been replaced by a multipolar competition that the West was ill-equipped to lead. "We won the past, son," Elias finally said, his heart heavy with the truth. "We fought the war we were good at. We used the hammers we built. But they were playing a game of shadows and time, a game we didn't even know was happening until the lights went out." The new world was characterized by a great and sudden decentralization. The global internet was now three different, competing internets that rarely spoke to one another. The global currency was a dozen different digital tokens, none of which cared for the stability of the greenback. The victory in Iran had been the final catalyst for the fragmentation of the planet. The world was no longer a global village. It was a series of fortified, suspicious camps, and the most heavily fortified camp of all was the one currently struggling to keep the heaters running in its own capital. Elias stood up, his joints protesting the cold. He left the map on the bench. He didn't need it anymore. The lines were already etched into his mind. He began to walk toward the bridge, his footsteps echoing on the pavement. Behind him, the young soldier stayed on the bench, a silent sentinel for a country that was trying to remember how to be itself without being the master of everywhere else. As the sun began to set over the Potomac, the camera of history seemed to pan up, rising above the silent monuments of Washington, above the darkened halls of the Capitol, and higher still, into the cold, silent orbit, where the satellites still drifted like lonely stars. From this height, the Middle East was no longer a battlefield of red and blue icons. It was a tapestry of lights, vast, interconnected, and shifting. The fires of the Great Fury had been extinguished, replaced by the steady, cold glow of new cities, new trade hubs, and new pipelines that stretched toward the east, toward the rising sun, toward a future that had moved on while the giant was busy fighting the ghost of his own making. The American victory was invisible from this height. What was visible was the movement of energy, the flow of data, and the pulse of a world that had found a new center of gravity. The giant was still there, large and formidable, but he was standing on the shore of a river that had changed its course. The water was flowing away from him, and no amount of steel or fire could bring it back. The final image of this era was the map Elias Thorne left on the park bench. The wind caught the paper, flipping the pages until it landed on a blank sheet at the very end. On that sheet, someone had scrawled a single sentence in charcoal, a final epitaph for the dream of total dominance. The mountain did not move. The world faded into a deep, resonant black. There was no music, only the distant, rhythmic sound of a heart beating, the pulse of a new world that was just beginning to wake up, while the old one finally accepted its long overdue sleep. The story of the crossroads was over. The reality had been settled. The US victory was a masterpiece of military science and a catastrophe of human understanding. The mountain remained, the wind continued to blow, and the giant was finally home, sitting in the dark, listening to the silence of a world that no longer needed his protection. As the echoes of the last engines fade into the stillness of the desert, we are left to contemplate the ruins of an ambition that spanned generations. This journey through the fires of the Persian Gulf and the cold hallways of power reminds us that the strength of an empire is not measured by the weight of its bombs, but by the resilience of the world it seeks to lead. When the maps are redrawn and the headlines are forgotten, the truth remains written in the salt and the stone. We have witnessed the end of an era, not with a final explosion, but with the quiet realization that the world is far larger, older, and more patient than the machines we build to conquer it. The sun sets on the age of hegemony, leaving us to find our way in the twilight of a new, multipolar dawn. The story has been told, the path has been walked, and the silence that remains is the only honest answer to the questions we dare to ask. The giant is home. The mountain is still. The rest is history.